I haven't got any slides, which is good news, given how difficult it is to get them up. But I have got a tricky thing because I want to try in just 5 minutes to give you some optimism. You now know why those of us who work in housing get so pessimistic. But let's try the optimism. The good news is that we don't have a housing crisis because the Luftwaffe have just come over and bombed our housing. I was in Bristol this lunchtime looking at various sites which had been built because of the bombing in this city, and because the report is coming out, I think, on Friday about how Bristol is seeing rapid increases in inequality and a housing crisis of affordability in Bristol. We don't have a housing crisis because the Thames Barrier has failed and there's been a very high sea surge in the North Sea and London has flooded. We have most of the stock we need. We have the sewer systems underneath it. We actually managed to build more rooms, not houses, but rooms between 2001 and 2011 than the influx of people. So we actually have more rooms in our housing stock in the UK per person than we've had before. It's just our inability to share it out. That is the problem. To have a decent way of controlling our housing. It would be harder if it was a problem of a tsunami, or you can go through all the scenarios. But we've managed to create the equivalent ourselves. It is becoming evident to a very large number of people, including very affluent people in very affluent parts of the country, that this is a problem. I was in Dorchester down in Dorset last week talking to a group of 500 people with an average age of 75, and they were worried about housing because of their children and grandchildren in London. So if the most affluent are affected, you get to a point where people do begin to realise you're not all going to fund your pensions out of becoming buy-to-let landlords. It is not possible. It is also not that easy to be a buy-to-let landlord. So what do you need to do? You cannot solve it locally. Oxford City Council recently was quietly spiriting away money to try to build another 500 homes. It hasn't built any for 15 years. Osborne stole the money about 3 weeks ago. You cannot solve this locally. You need to have a national government who wishes to solve it, but you can't have any old national government. A new Labour government will refurbish the council stock, but they will not change the nature of the direction in which you're going. So you need to do things like put up somebody who doesn't want to be elected, get hundreds of thousands of people to join a party, manage to get an MP at the last minute to sign it. It was my MP, Andrew Smith, I think might have been the last one, with 5 seconds to go. That's the kind of change you actually need. The other scenario is that we have the crash, and then any government, even this government, would have to do various things which it would find unpalatable. Don't underestimate how much a government can change and a party can change. Every single Conservative MP voted against the introduction of a minimum wage in 1997. We now have a Chancellor of the Exchequer who is going to introduce a minimum wage in a couple of years at a level which means that he will determine the income of a quarter of the population in work in this country. That's almost Stalinist. Incredible things can happen without actually having to get a government of people who have some common sense in. Anyway, what do you need to do? And very, very quickly, the first and most urgent thing to do is to change the law on assured short-hold tenancies. It is very, very easy to change the law on these tenancy agreements because they only last for a year. So all the existing contracts are null and void within 12 months. You change the law in House of Commons and you suddenly got 3-year tenancies. I'd go for 5-year tenancies with people with children. You can't put up the rent during that time. And when and if there is a crash in prices, and all that a crash requires is a fall in sentiment. The only thing holding our housing market up is sentiment. When house prices cry and all those amateur buy-to-let landlords have to try to sell very, very quickly, as they did in Dublin, as they've done all over Europe when this has happened before, the tenants are sitting tenants and they cannot be evicted. That's the first thing you do. It's got very bad very recently. There are now 250,000 children living in poverty in London who are in private rented accommodation, more than the poor children of London living in council and housing association stock. Those children are being moved on average every 2 years. If you want to destroy inner London schools, the way to do it is to move 250,000 children between schools every 2 years. So it's a very rapid problem that's emerged. The minute you change the law on the short-hold tenancies, you decrease the value of housing to profiteers. That's the beginning of house prices coming down. It's going to come down one way or another. House prices are going to fall. The longest it's going to take is 10 years, because in 10 years' time, all those university students, half of young women in Britain, who are going to have average debts of £57,000, come on the market as first-time buyers. Right? So you can see the end. This is going to happen. The question is, are we going to manage it with more civility or less civility? That's the immediate thing you do. The second thing you need to do is to work out how to encourage people to move around in the stock so that we make better use of it. We have enough housing in this country for every family and every single person to live somewhere with a spare bedroom. That's how much we've got. You don't want to force anybody to move. But you don't want a situation in which it makes sense for people to sit in housing that is too large for them, which they cannot afford to heat, in which they are getting lonely. And we have an epidemic of loneliness as well at the same time. Falling house prices, hopefully steady, would encourage people to get out of large family houses that they're living in on their own, because the longer you stay in it, the less money you can pass on to your children, which is why it makes sense to start dealing with the private rented sector. In the flats I was in this lunchtime in Bristol, these were maisonettes. They were built for families, family of 4. Now many of them are private rented, and you can see one young professional lives in the middle of Bristol. So 4 people can no longer live in that. This is part of our problem. But there are ways of doing this. You need to tell the Green Party that you cannot move people from the southeast of England to Newcastle in retirement. Newcastle is a lovely place to be, but it is not having to demolish housing, so you cannot have that. The Green Party need to understand that there needs to be some building, particularly of retirement apartments on the edges of the city, so that people can move locally out of family housing and still be near their friends. One of the good reasons why we have a housing crisis is that we're now living in the middle class at least until our 80s and early 90s. We have a housing stock which worked quite well when we conveniently died about 72 years of age. There's nothing wrong with the fact we're living to older age, but we have a lack of a stock for older people, including no stairs. You do not want stairs, which means you want apartments and lifts, and you want views. And finally, we need to build. And we need to build because our population is rising. Rising population is a very, very good thing. It is very bad to be living somewhere where people are leaving. There are people coming, but we're going to have to build for people coming unless we decide to vote in a referendum to say that people can't come anymore as easily. Although even that, being optimistic, is a way of solving the housing crisis. I mean, if you really want a very, very rapid collapse in the housing market in Britain, voting to prevent large numbers of people coming into the country, and also spending 18 months discussing how much you hate lots of people who are already here, is a very good way of engineering that housing crisis. It is all solvable. It is now affecting the middle and upper middle classes. It's a very tiny number of people who do well out of it. Most landlords do badly out of this because most landlords are amateur landlords who own 1 or 2 properties, and they don't know how to do it. So they actually I get letters from landlords telling me what a bad time they have with their tenants. You don't start trying to do something you don't know how to do. It's a small number of people who've done well out of this. They are greedy. We've let them do it. The question is, are we stupid or are we very stupid? If we're just stupid, we'll begin to sort it out now and soon. John Healey is the Shadow Housing Minister if you want to write to somebody. And John Healey is still in the Shadow Cabinet, thankfully. That's one of the things that has to happen. The Shadow Cabinet has to hang together long enough. I do not know who the Cabinet Minister is for housing anymore because I've lost any faith that they will do anything. If we're stupid, we will begin to sort this out. If we're very stupid, we will leave it and we will head back to the 1920s and the 90% private rented country, and we can head back to the majority of our children becoming servants for the affluent and living in Bantustans and getting the bus in when they're needed. We're not very stupid. We have been a bit stupid. But I do think we can begin to sort this out. We do have to recognise those of us who've got a mortgage or own outright, we don't actually have a nest egg because it isn't worth the amount of money they tell us it's worth. Housing is currently valued at how much people who are desperate are buying for it right now. In Bristol, the housing explosion in London has finally hit Bristol now. It passed through Oxford about a year ago. It went through Chipping Norton about 6 months ago, and it's coming through now. People with fairly good jobs.
Have to stop too.
I will stop. People with fairly good jobs in Bristol who are renting are desperately buying because they're worried they won't be able to afford the rent. That is exactly what happened in 1989 when we went up to our last mini house price.